Today in the EU, Starmer's first shot at resetting ties with Brussels. The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is meeting with EU executives in Brussels today for the first time since he won the UK general elections last July. He promised to rekindle the relationship with Brussels after Brexit, but so far, many in the Union are afraid that the Prime Minister might turn out to be a less collaborative partner than the EU might have expected. Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. I'm joined in the studio by Owen Morgan, news editor at Euractiv. Hi, Owen.
Hey, Giada.
We're here to talk about the future of the EU-UK relationship and what role the meeting of today will play in it. But before we get to that, I think it's important to contextualize the latest developments. Von der Leyen has basically made clear that before moving on, Starmer must abide by the terms his predecessor negotiated. So, what is still up for contention?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Giada. So Keir Starmer, since he was elected last July as the new UK Prime Minister, he's had a very, very busy summer. He's been out to the member states. He's visited France, Germany, Italy. He's hosted a summit of the European Political Community in Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. And he's met EU leaders to try and pitch what he is calling his reset of EU-UK relations.
We can only make progress on the issues that so many people care about if we have the maturity and leadership to reach out a hand to our European friends.
But amid all of that in the summer, there were reports around August time that the Commission had sent the UK a letter outlining a number of issues with the existing implementation of the agreements in the UK that they weren't happy with. So I think it's important to point out here, so when we talk about a reset of EU-UK relations, what we're often talking about is the trading relationship, and there's the trade and cooperation agreement signed between the two sides that sets that out. What the Commission is taking issue with in particular is the previous agreement, the divorce agreement called the withdrawal agreement.
And what are some of the issues within the withdrawal agreement that the EU is currently dissatisfied with?
So there's a number of things. The letter, as we understand, contained 8 specific issues. Some of them are very, very technical, but they broadly concern 2 questions. They concern the rights of EU citizens who live in the UK, and they concern the question of Northern Ireland. Both of these were issues that the withdrawal agreement attempted to solve. A solution was reached, but it's become clear that the UK has not fully implemented those obligations. If we take the case of citizens' rights, for instance, the UK offered EU citizens a pathway to retain their rights and live in the UK after Brexit. They did so through what was called the EU settlement scheme, and it offers 2 statuses, the EU settlement scheme. One is called pre-settled status, which is for EU citizens who've been in the UK less than 5 years, and one is called settled status for people who've been there more than 5 years. And what's happened is, in 2022, a UK court ruled that this first status, this pre-settled status, this interim status, if you like, was actually unlawful and incompatible with the withdrawal agreement. This is something the Commission's been raising with the UK for a number of years. They were actually a party to the court proceeding in the UK. It's quite unprecedented. But the UK, some years later, is still to fully implement that judgment and recognise the rights of those citizens who have pre-settled status. And this is one of the key issues that the Commission's put across. They've also reopened an infringement proceeding, so they've taken their own action as guardians of the treaties and the guardians of EU law against the UK. So this is one issue that I think is really, really important.
The issue of Northern Ireland has also raised tensions. The country has always had a special status and specific conditions regarding its borders, all things that have been accounted for in the Windsor framework, in addition to the withdrawal agreement. Now, what is the problem there?
So it's difficult to say. So the withdrawal agreement, when it was originally signed, contained what was called the Northern Ireland Protocol, which set out a load of rules to prevent a hard border from appearing between Northern Ireland and Ireland. It became quite clear after some time, as it often is with agreements that are negotiated against a ticking clock, that there are some gaps in this agreement. So the Windsor framework was produced in February 23, I believe, and that sought to ease some of the frictions that businesses were experiencing, particularly with regards to trade between the UK and Northern Ireland, or from Great Britain and Northern Ireland, rather. This agreement did foresee a very staggered implementation of the obligations, so things would come in gradually to give businesses time to prepare. But This, from the very beginning, has been fraught with politicisation. Unionists in Northern Ireland, so a group that typically considered themselves British, see the Windsor Framework as reinforcing what they call a sea border in the Irish Sea that separates them from Great Britain. These kind of political considerations have been picked up on by previous Conservative governments, and certain elements have been delayed further in the implementation in order to appease this group of Unionists in Northern Ireland. The Commission is now appearing to draw a bit more of a firm line, saying, no, we need to see some good faith implementation from you. We've agreed this. We made a lot of concessions to agree this. We expect it to be implemented. And this is one of the things that they've put across in their letter over the summer.
So this is the point of view of the European Commission. Now, when we come to why Starmer is here today, what is the focus for the Prime Minister?
It's a very good question, and this is something that's been open to a lot of speculation. When trying to report on this week, we've dealt with two, to be frank, quite opaque institutions, which is typical of the Commission with regards to the UK relationship. But also with London, both sides are keeping their cards very close to their chest ahead of this meeting. As far as we understand, Keir Starmer has talked a lot about this idea of a reset. There are ideas ranging. There's specific trade issues that he's been floating or that his team have been floating in the UK press to see how they would land. Things like, for instance, veterinary agreements, so that would ease sort of agri-food exports to the continent for UK farmers.
And defence as well, right?
Yep, so defence is absolutely an area that we're expecting the two to talk about this today. There appears to be recognition on both sides that, working together in the current geopolitical context is mutually beneficial. I mean, the UK, for all the withdrawal and impacts of Brexit, remains a military power, and it has a substantial defence industry. We've talked at length about what the EU needs to do to scale up defence. So there's plenty of anticipation here to see today what von der Leyen thinks the UK can do to help in her big defence push that she's got planned for the new Commission.
I was wondering, do you think migration is going to be an object of discussion? We've seen, the death toll in the Channel really get to worrying numbers. And as well in the bloc, the subject has gained a lot of traction politically. Can we expect the opening of negotiations today?
Again, it's difficult to say given the very limited information we have, but I would anticipate that you're not going to get any kind of big bang announcement on migration today. You're very right to say that it's a priority on both sides. We saw a few weeks back, Keir Starmer met with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and they are alleged to have spoken about the Italy-Albania deal for asylum outsourcing, which is eerily similar to the UK's Rwanda scheme that Keir Starmer actually abolished on day one of his premiership.
What we discussed today is a common challenge, which is irregular migration. We are pragmatists first and foremost. When we see a challenge, we discuss with our friends and allies the different approaches that are being taken, look at what works, and that's the approach that we've taken today, and it's been a very productive day.
But despite that kind of political common ground, I don't think this is an issue that's going to be dealt with at the EU level. What I think you're more likely to see is Starmer continue to do what he's done so far and tour the member states, be very charming. He'll be for sure knocking on Emmanuel Macron's door and trying to find some bilateral solutions there. But I think the political capital that the two sides have is probably better spent on issues where the EU has a really clear competence to get deals done, and equally where the UK has sort of the political space to do so.
Let's be specific here. What are more fertile areas for cooperation?
So I think aside from defence, there's a number of issues, not just immediate, but also really clearly mutual beneficial, and that industry, more importantly, on both sides of the Channel are calling for. I'm thinking of questions like carbon trading schemes. So the UK and the EU both have their version of the ETS. They're slightly different, but wholly similar. And it appears that the UK, if it doesn't sort of align with the EU's ETS, will be paying a carbon tax on all its imports. So this seems like a very obvious area for cooperation. The UK has also been offered by the European Commission a deal on youth mobility. This is particularly politically sensitive because obviously British youths voted overwhelmingly against Brexit. They feel very hard done by, and I think this would be a real olive branch from the EU towards the UK. This is an issue that's so far been rejected by Keir Starmer. I think he's particularly scared of being seen at home as embracing anything that even closely resembles free movement. We know that immigration and the ending of free movement was one of the major drivers of the vote to leave the EU back in 2016. And despite having all this political space back home and this massive majority after his win in the election in July, we do have the likes of Nigel Farage in Parliament now, and there are Brexiteers who are, waiting to make noise on something like that. So a deal there is difficult, but not impossible.
To me, the issue of Erasmus is quite a symbolic one because, once again, as you said, Starmer won with an overwhelming majority, and yet he seems to be very reluctant to concede anything to the EU. There was a lot of optimism and hope ahead of his election. Do we have reason now to be as optimistic, seeing how reluctant he's been to say yes to, any olive branches?
I think it depends who you ask. I mean, I'm obviously a Brit. I, speak with my British friends and family constantly. There was a major optimism among those who regret Brexit that Starmer's election might be a catalyst for some kind of change. And I think we can't underestimate the fact that the political level in the European Commission, the language is much changed. Both sides are using this language of a reset now. We saw earlier this week, Maroš Šefčovič met the UK EU Affairs Minister, Nick Thomas-Symonds, and he tweeted about that language, that very language Starmer is using, calling for a reset and embracing a joint agenda. And that is a change. What gives me less cause for optimism is what we've discussed, that there are existing agreements that remain unimplemented. The Commission, certainly not with the EU, but I'd imagine with any third country, is really unlikely to accept agreements going unhonoured. And I think I'm not confident that there is a full understanding in Keir Starmer's team from the conversations I'm having as to the extent to which implementing that withdrawal agreement in full is required before you go and ask for further concessions and before you pursue this reset more fully. So I think there is cause for optimism, but I don't think we can expect to see progress very soon. We might see discussions slowly start. As ever, both sides will have to be very careful to protect any talks that go on and prevent outside political influence, because we know how politicised these Brexit issues can become on both sides. But it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of today's meeting.
Thank you, Owen.
Thanks, Giada.
I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This podcast was produced by Miriam Sánchez Tejada, Charles Cohen, and I. See you tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.